All right, I think I got all my buttons straight. How did your Earth Hour go tonight? Weather seems relatively quiet tonight on Planet E, at least from where I stand. This is Ian Punnett with a face for radio and a voice for print. Fortunately, no massive flooding to report like last week, and whatever damage has been done this spring thus far is being cleaned up as we speak. But as I look out my window here in the upper Midwest, I am reminded of how much more snow there still is on the ground in places, and how much melting will still be happening along with the usual spring rains. Because we've already had all of this flooding, and we haven't even had the spring rains yet. What will that mean for so many people downriver? Meanwhile, there is massive solar cycle activity, and we'll get to more of that coming up in crypto news. Also, teenagers are actually human children possessed by alien reptile brains. How to kill a man using some black cloth, a human bone, some thread, and a toad. Plus, the latest on our investigation into the D.B. Cooper mystery, and more about tonight's guest, Private Eye Vito Colucci, coming up next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. Coming up next hour, inside the private eyes of a PI. It's kind of the theme for tonight's show, actually, is our guest, our first guest, Galen Cook, coming up a little bit later on this hour, also does a little private investigation of his own. He is an attorney looking into the D.B. Cooper case. We'll talk about new developments this week on that story with him coming up a little bit later on this hour. But next hour, inside the private eyes of a PI, Vito Colucci, very entertaining writer. He's worked on a lot of high-profile cases, and he has some unique perspectives as to what happened in those cases. We'll talk about specifically some of the work that he's done on the Michael Skakel case, plus some other unusual aspects of what it really means to be a private eye. What do you learn about the human condition from a private investigator? We'll talk about it coming up next hour on Coast to Coast AM. And in the meantime, lots to get to in crypto news this morning. Of course, some of this news might have been covered in the mainstream, such as the story out of Washington reported by, I think this is a New York Times piece, the Treasury Department will propose on Monday that Congress give the Federal Reserve broad new authority to oversee financial market stability, in effect allowing it to send SWAT teams into any corner of the industry or any institution that might pose a risk to the overall system. Increased federal power in the economy at a time when things appear to be going down on one knee. And I say appear to be because I heard an interesting theory from a friend, and I keep thinking about this. Somebody he knew who knew a lot about the economy, knows a lot about the economy, said that maybe there's a chance that we are purposefully allowing the dollar to depreciate as a way of depowering China. That so much of China's economy is based on the American dollar, that by holding our success back, we hold their success back too. Don't know. One global way of looking at it anyway. Maybe that's worthy of a show coming up sometime soon on Coast to Coast AM. Barely 3 months after forecasters announced the beginning of the new solar cycle 24, old solar cycle 23 has returned. This is a story from phys.org.com this week. 3 big sunspots appeared, and they are all old cycle spots, says NASA solar physicist David Hathaway. Quote, "We know this because of their magnetic polarity. What's going on?" Hathaway explains, quote, "We have 2 solar cycles in progress at the same time. Solar cycle 24 has begun. The first new cycle spot appeared in January, but solar cycle 23 has also not yet ended." Not at all unusual, perhaps, but all this solar activity is expected to make this year a year of transformation. Speaking of which, are teenage brains really different than that of adult humans? According to another story on phys.org.com, yes, many parents are convinced that the brains of their teenage offspring are different than those of children and adults. New data confirms this is the case. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, published in a April 2008 issue of the Journal of Adolescent Health. It describes how brain changes in the adolescent brain impact cognition, emotion, and behavior. I won't read you the whole piece, but it is fascinating. Here's the headline from it. You might think that those are your kids, but adolescent brains are very similar to hardy reptiles. Turns out, if you want to see a brain that's uniquely designed for, quote, novelty-seeking, sensation-seeking, and risk-taking behaviors, then open up the skull of your average teenager. I'll repeat that. If you want to see a brain that's uniquely designed for, quote, novelty-seeking, sensation-seeking, and risk-taking behaviors, then just open up the skull of your average teenager. Or apparently your average governor of New York, too, for that matter. And remember last week's conversation about a politician who seemed as if she were daring people to catch her in a lie? We talked about this video. We were among the first of the national radio shows to point out this viral video of Hillary Clinton in Bosnia that completely contradicted her story of her black ops as first lady. And I wondered last week whether the Sunday morning news shows were going to pick up the story and run the video that was flying everywhere on the net. As far as I know, only one did on Sunday, but by Tuesday, of course, the story had become huge. Frank Rich wrote about that in what will appear in tomorrow's Sunday New York Times. This event may be a watershed, he wrote, because Mrs. Clinton's character and candidacy spilling over into the 2000 campaign as a whole, and it reveals, and this is the part I thought was interesting, the accelerating power of viral politics, as exemplified by YouTube, to override the, quote, retail politics still venerated by the Beltway establishment. Boy, don't we see that over and over again? The people that are all the Beltway insiders that still think, regardless of party, that they can control the message, even in the face of the democratization of information on the Internet. So is the story false? Well, it turns out it's true. The story of the landing at the airport in Bosnia, it turns out it's true. It's just that then First Rambo Hillary Clinton wasn't a part of it. There's a story in the Washington Post about how it was actually Senator Olympia Snowe, Republican of Maine, and 6 other Republican and Democratic senators that went on a fact-finding mission through war-torn Sarajevo just before the Dayton Accords resulted in a U.S. military presence on the ground in Bosnia. They went through every single thing that was described by Senator Clinton. They actually experienced it. All of the sniping of the runway, they had to duck armored cars. It's just, you know, they have the video to back it up. Now, how about that for a coincidence? What are the odds? How about the same odds as splitting one arrow with another arrow? Blind? That's a story you can link up to at coasttocoastam.com. An archer has achieved a 1 in a million feat of marksmanship after splitting one arrow with another arrow. What makes this shot even more remarkable is that Tilly Trotter, 74-year-old grandmother Tilly Trotter, is blind. She pulled off the shot, known among archers as a Robin Hood, at a practice session of the Wellington Bowmen in Somerset. Mrs. Trotter, who's been an archer for 2 years at the invitation of her granddaughter Charlotte, said, quote, "The second arrow made such a noise going into the back of the previous arrow that I thought I had hit the ceiling or done some expensive damage. Then I heard people jumping up and down and shouting that I'd done a Robin Hood. It was a 1 in a million shot and a bit of a fluke, really," she said. Her husband, Tony, is crucial to her success. He's the one that helps her shoot at the target. Peter Jones, a spokesman for the Grand National Archery Society, said, quote, "It's a very rare feat, like getting 2 holes in one on the same round of golf." But I beg to differ. I mean, doing a Robin Hood would be like getting 2 holes in one on the same round of golf in the same hole, where one golf ball lands with such force that it splits the other golf ball in half. That's what I think, anyway. And also doing it at Forest Hills, not Sherwood Forest. Unlike Robin Hood, though, this lady is real. It's a very cool story. You'll find out more about it at coasttocoastam.com. And as real as Santa Claus. See this story out of Rice, Utah. A small but dedicated group of rock art preservationists in Utah, the 9 Mile Canyon Coalition, and their allies are fighting to preserve what may be the original Santa Claus. You got to go see it. 9 Mile Canyon, located high on the side of a sheer cliff in a rugged place in central Utah. There's an ancient petroglyph that dates back over 1,000 years. It has an uncanny resemblance to the modern-day Santa, an elf, and his 9 reindeer. You go see what I mean, coasttocoastam.com. You'll see the picture. While you're there, take a look at the complete version of this story about voodoo. Well, this story comes out of Atamaca, Mexico. To kill a man, voodoo practitioner Alejandro Gallegos Garcias explains, all you need is a black cloth doll, some thread, a human bone, and a toad. Oh, the story says, and you must ask the devil permission in person at a cave in the hills where it's said the devil appears. Assuming that you have these things, plus the green light from the Prince of Darkness, you simply lash the doll to the bone, shove it down the unfortunate toad's throat, sew up its lips, and take the whole mess to a graveyard, reciting the proper words. The person will die within 30 days. The person will die within 30 days. I guess that's what you're supposed to repeat. Anyway, that according to Mr. Gallegos, who promises the person will die within 30 days. Now, if you don't practice voodoo, I think there's actually another way to kill a man using black cloth, some thread, a human bone, and a toad. And here's how you do it. You take the human bone and you fashion it into a sewing needle. Using the thread and the bone needle, you make the black cloth into a little ninja outfit for the toad. And then, once the toad is dressed as a ninja assassin, then carefully explain to him why the victim in question simply must die. You might want to give the toad several $1,000s for travel expenses and then send him on his way. May take a little longer than 30 days, but, you know, the victim will never see the ninja toad assassin coming. Be the perfect stealth maneuver. And Galen Cook is here on Coast to Coast AM to talk about one more story in crypto news this week. Good evening, Galen.
Good evening, Ian, and thank you for having me back on.
Always a pleasure. And we're going to stay with this story until we find an ending to the mystery someday of D.B. Cooper out of Los Angeles. A couple of news stories I'm going to quote from to get us started. Earlier this week, quote, a tattered parachute found in a rugged region of northwest Washington state may yield clues to the fate of the robber behind a daring high-altitude hijacking 37 years ago, according to reports on Wednesday. The Seattle PI reported that a parachute found on rural land was being examined to see if it belonged to D.B. Cooper, who left from Northwest Airlines jet in 1971 after collecting $200,000 in ransom. FBI investigators have for years said D.B. Cooper most likely did not survive the jump from 10,000 feet, but the hijacker's body has never been found. The recently discovered parachute is believed to be similar to the one Cooper used and was dug up by a man plowing land at his property in Clark County, according to FBI agent Larry Carr. If D.B. Cooper had pulled his chute not long after that jump, he would have landed in that area, Larry Carr said. Is this D.B. Cooper's parachute? We don't know yet. I'm going to read another news report on this, too. If it is Cooper's parachute, that will solve one mystery, where he apparently landed, but it will raise another, Larry Carr said. In 1980, a family on a picnic found $5,880 of Cooper's money in a bag on a Columbia River beach near Vancouver. Some investigators believed it might have been washed down to the river by the Washougal River, but if Cooper landed near Amboy and stashed the money bag there, there's no way it could have naturally reached the river. If this is D.B. Cooper's parachute, the money could not have arrived at its discovery location by natural means, Larry Carr said. That whole theory is out the window. How does that sound to you? You've been investigating the story. Did they get all the facts right?
Pretty much. There's even a third one, and that is how many chutes did Cooper take out of the back of that 727? I've got a little bit of conflicting information, Ian. I was told by a reliable source at the FBI that Cooper jumped out with two chutes, an NB either 6 or an NB 8 military-style back chute,
right,
plus the reserve chute that had the X marked on it. Now, I went back and looked at some old records. These are 25 years old. And what I found, and I just found this tonight actually, is that 3 chutes were left on the 727 when it landed in Reno. So the hijacker could only have taken 1 chute out, and that would have been that military chute. So there's some conflicting information there. I've always assumed that Cooper jumped out with 2 chutes.
Right.
But now I'm finding that he left 3 behind, and the reason he did that was because he didn't have the D-rings that were needed to connect that backpack to the front pack. The front pack being the reserve chute, the backpack being the main chute. So that's another mystery that I'd like to see cleared up.
All right. Now, what about this? Because I remember you were very clear about this, and I thought it was very interesting. You were offering a possibility that the money that was found in the river might have come from the money that D.B. Cooper jammed in his pockets before he jumped out of the plane.
Well, let's make an assumption, and that assumption being that the parachute that was found in this location in southwest Washington near Amboy and Ariel, let's make the assumption that that is D.B. Cooper's chute. From what I've heard from my sources is that it looked like a military-style chute. It was white, very soiled, and apparently it had either been somewhat dug into the ground or had been covered up by leaves and that kind of a thing to hide it. So we have to make that assumption that that is Cooper's chute. We don't know yet, and the FBI is going to probably move a little slow on that. But if that's true, then the money found on the banks of the Columbia River it's a baffling clue because that doesn't make any sense. And let me explain a little bit further.
No, wait, let me jump in and say, can't the FBI, the FBI has, in fact, confirmed that the money that was found along the river was money that came from the hijacking, right? We know for sure that was money that was marked money for D.B. Cooper.
Exactly correct. That was Cooper's money.
So we know that for sure. So now go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. So, yeah, you're right, Ian. Now, if the parachute turns out to be Cooper's, and I have every reason to believe that it's going to be Cooper's, I wrote these distances down. So your audience can understand it a little more clearly. The money was found on February the 10th, 1980, and it was found on a small little bank along the Columbia River called Tina's Bar near the old Fazio farmhouse, which is located 8 miles northwest of Vancouver, Washington. Now, on March the 3rd, 2008, that was just less than a month ago, this parachute was found by 2 young boys on their father's farmlands near Amboy, Washington. And I don't know exactly the location, but I can narrow it down pretty much from what I've heard. It's between Bald Mountain and Green Mountain, and between the towns of Ariel and Amboy, and it is farming land. And so if you draw a line down to Vancouver, it's exactly 25 miles northeast of Vancouver. Now, if you draw another line from where the probable location of the parachute is to where the money was found, that's a distance of 20 miles. The problem is where the money was found is further south of where the parachute was found, meaning that Cooper landed 20 miles from where the money was found. Now, that doesn't make any sense. Now, there's a couple other theories. One was that the money was lifted by rains or something, and it was deposited in one of the rivers that flow into the Columbia. The first theory was that it might have reached the Columbia River by way of the Lewis River, which is a tributary in that area where the parachute was found. The problem with that theory, the reason it won't work, is because the Lewis River drains into the Columbia about 10 miles downriver of where the money was found. So there's no way the Lewis River could have deposited the money.
All right, then we can dispense with that theory, but hang on, let's get the other ones. And I'm going to shoot the phone numbers out, too, just because it's always been helpful to keep the conversation going with Galen about D.B. Cooper. And we'll find out whether there aren't some things, too, that we could use the help of a private investigator on, as we have a guest coming up next hour who's going to follow this theme tonight. Inside the private eyes of a PI, Vito Colucci coming up next hour. And we'll continue with how could the money be found where it was if the parachute was found where it was earlier this week. Next on Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Ed, we're giving you the numbers here just in case you want to join in the conversation we're having about D.B. Cooper. And, yeah, it's a story arc we're following. Yep, I'm cracking the file open again because it feels like we're getting closer and closer, and I just don't want to give up on it. I think that this information's out there. Galen Cook and I were talking about this a couple of visits ago, that I just think that somewhere in some shoebox there is one more piece of this mystery. It's in the bottom of somebody's closet. It will explain everything. It will be the linchpin to this investigation, or it will come in the form of something like this: a parachute, long since forgotten about, discovered in a farmer's field by a couple of boys. So far, by the way, boys have been the key part to this whole investigation. Maybe we should have boys fan out across America to find D.B. Cooper's clues, because it was a boy who found the water found the money along the river back in 1980, and then now two boys with this parachute. So what does it all mean when we start putting it together? What assumptions can we make about the D.B. Cooper jump back in 1971? If this is D.B. Cooper's parachute in the farmer's field, and as we know, that was his money that was found along the river back in 1980. We'll let Galen Cook put it all together for us next and have you join in the conversation before our main guest, Vito Colucci, coming up next hour. And we look inside the private eyes of a private eye on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. We got a couple of people hanging on, but we'll get back to them on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett, and we're talking with Galen Cook, attorney who's been investigating the D.B. Cooper mystery, and we've been slowly coming up with some new turns and twists, and the FBI has been back on the case on this for a while, and Larry Carr was the guy we were quoting earlier in these stories. Have you been in touch with him, Galen?
The last time I talked with Larry actually was via the Internet. I sent him an email and asked him if he had received a copy of the picture the family gave me, and also a copy of the fingerprints of my suspect. And he sent me a short email back and said yes. Now, that was about 5 weeks ago, and I haven't heard from him since. But I have talked to Larry several times on the telephone.
All right. Now, I want to be clear about this, too, because you mentioned the family and the photograph. That's a separate story. That's what we've been talking about, too, this connection that we made through Coast to Coast AM with a family that said that their father, or in the case of the woman, her husband, her ex-husband, had been somebody who had claimed to have been D.B. Cooper, looked remarkably like D.B. Cooper, had the qualifications to have been D.B. Cooper, lived in the area. I mean, right down the line, in many of the most important aspects of the profile fit D.B. Cooper, and we put the picture on the website, and you could see the closeness between the actual photograph of this man and the artist's rendering of D.B. Cooper. And you sent the fingerprints. Now, what about the DNA sample? The FBI still says they have some? Well,
the FBI has claimed since last fall that they have a partial DNA sample from the from the tie that Cooper left behind on the aircraft. And they've used that to eliminate some of their prime suspects already. Now, I haven't given them any DNA from the family members of my suspect yet. I have given them the fingerprints, and I'm waiting to hear back on that. DNA testing takes considerably longer to match up than, say, comparing fingerprints.
Okay, so that's all we can say for now on the subject. But
I have one more thing I'm going to tell you in a minute, but I just want to get back to the what I was talking about before the break. There's only two drainages that go into the Columbia that you can look at. The Lewis River, we can no longer regard that as a possibility because it pours into the Columbia 10 miles downriver from where the money was found. The other river is the Washougal, which is about 20 miles upriver where it meets the Columbia, but there's nowhere on the map I can find where any of those tributaries reach into the area where the parachute is. So really, if you want to look at it from a standpoint of pure logic, there's no way by natural means that money of D.B. Cooper's could have reached where it did in the Columbia River from the site of where it looks like D.B. Cooper landed with his parachute. There's 20 miles of space between those two clues. And so the question is, how could one clue be so far away from another clue? Now, I spent 4.5 hours a couple of weeks ago talking with the widow of my D.B. Cooper suspect, and she had told me something previously on the telephone that kind of went over my head. I didn't pay too much attention to, but we did discuss the money aspect, and I asked her again to reiterate how the money could have ended up on the Columbia River, and this was before the news came out last week of D.B. Cooper's parachute being found. And the widow told me, she said, well, it was planted. And the first time I heard that, when I talked with her on the phone, I didn't regard that as a very good answer because I figured D.B. Cooper probably landed with his parachute somewhere not far from where the money was found on the river. That was the logic I was using, and I think others were looking at that area too. But when they found the parachute and they went out to the media last week and said they found it in the original search area, all of a sudden that changes the whole scope of this investigation. So did D.B. Cooper plant the money somewhere outside of the drop zone of where he landed? That's the question, and maybe next hour when you talk with your professional investigator, you can ask him that question, why someone would plant money that far away and expect it to be found, and it was found 9 years later. Was that to throw off his pursuers? What was the rationale for the skyjacker to do that?
Well, and let's pick at that just a little bit. If you're going to plant money, is that the way that you would do it? And I guess maybe part of me says that you take too many chances that the money's not going to be found. If you're intending to get the FBI off your trail, and you're intending to send people down some wild, river chase, as it were, well, then why not put it in a place which would have been found earlier than 1980?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and somewhere where it would be found much easier, too. Where it was found was in a remote area. It's actually kind of wildlife refuge area. I've been there many times, and this little kid who was 8 years old, he was with his parents getting ready for a barbecue along the beach, and he just happened to be digging a fire pit, and an inch or inch and a half down on the silt, that's where the money was found. Now, that's not a place you'd plant money, but my guess is it would never have been planted there. It was more likely deposited there during a high water episode on the river. That money had probably been in the water for some time. So if it was planted, it would have probably been planted closer to either Vancouver or Portland, upriver about 6 or 7 miles.
Now I want to go back a little bit and just throw something else in the mix on this before we start picking up the phones. And thank you everybody for being patient. We're talking with the D.B. Cooper investigator, Galen Cook. On our suspect, on this guy that has come up since we started this conversation, we have a solid DNA sample of him, correct?
According to the FBI,
no, you have one of the suspect.
No,
of our guy.
I have access to one. There's 3 sons involved in this, and any of the 3 sons or all 3 of them said they would be willing to submit to DNA. But I don't think we're there yet because I haven't even heard back from the FBI regarding the fingerprint.
That would be my question, though, is if you've got a DNA sample and a really good suspect, what is the FBI waiting for Isn't that why they said we have DNA to test it against?
You're asking a really good question, Ian. In fact, I got a question that probably the answer before that. The FBI has come out a couple times now and said they want the public's help in solving this crime.
Right.
And the first time they came out several months ago, Larry Carr went on the television and the radio and the newspaper, and they kind of reopened this case when they had a suspect back in October, this guy Kenny Christensen, and they later ruled him out. Now, the FBI is asking the public's help again, and they're looking for an expert on identifying this parachute, and they want to do it forensically or through scientific analysis. But I was on the phone 2 days ago with a gentleman in Seattle who actually packed the parachute that D.B. Cooper used to jump out of the plane with. The guy's name is Earl Cossey, and he owned the parachute and jump school in Seattle from which all of the parachutes that were obtained by the FBI and brought to the plane that night, they all came from Earl Cossey's jump school. I got on the phone, talked with Mr. Cossey, and I asked him if he would be able to identify the parachute, and he said in a minute. And the reason why is because not only did he pack that NB-8 or that NB-6 military chute, he also assembled it, the rigging, the harnesses, the whole thing. And he said that he could identify his own work. Apparently, these guys leave their signature of some kind, how they construct these parachutes. He said he could examine it and probably tell the FBI within minutes whether or not that chute came from Mr. Cossey's jump school or if, in fact, it was the exact chute that D.B. Cooper used. Because we know right. now that D.B. Cooper used one of those parachutes.
Right.
So the FBI, they want to turn to forensic analysis, which could take months and months and months, but Mr. Cossey has not received a phone call from the FBI, and he said if the FBI calls him, he'll go down there in a minute. But he said they have not called him, and he doesn't understand it.
The FBI could call the guy who packed the parachute and know more immediately. The FBI could test the DNA sample that we could get and know more immediately. The FBI could look at the fingerprint that you sent them and know more immediately. And the FBI could do more with the photograph that we sent them with the eyewitnesses, and they haven't done that either, as far as you know.
It makes you wonder if the FBI really wants to solve the D.B. Cooper case,
I swear that's really, you really have to wonder. Well, let's go ahead and get a couple of thoughts on this east of the Rockies. Bill is hanging on, Coast to Coast AM. Bill, you're talking with Galen Cook.
Hey, Galen, listen, Mark Furman is telling Fox News tonight that this Cossey gentleman that you just talked about has seen the parachute and authenticating it, but refused to tell Mark Furman and Fox whether or not that was the D.B. Cooper parachute. He just said he wanted to wait a couple of days before he talked to Furman. So you might want to circle back and speak with Mr. Cossey.
Well, I talked with Mr. Cossey on Thursday. We had a telephone interview, and I have no reason to believe that Mr. Cossey would have misinformed me. He said he has not seen the chute as of Thursday and not heard from the FBI, and he told me he could identify his own chute upon visual examination.
Now, could Mark Furman be saying that Mr. Cossey has seen the parachute on television, not in person?
I don't know that level of detail. All I can tell you is that he is reporting that he has seen it. He went to him for an interview, and all of a sudden, Cossey wouldn't talk to Furman, that he said he would talk to him in a couple of days. He'd been told not to talk to Furman by the FBI. My question is, back to resources, how much resources have been put in looking at this guy from Florida, and can you tell us about what his career was? The suspect that you have, can you tell us about what his career was and what his personality was like?
No, you said Florida. My suspect is never in Florida.
Wasn't a Florida guy. It's okay. Because our guy is actually much closer to the Northwest and Upper Midwest. Go ahead.
Does your caller does he want me to expound a little bit on my suspect?
Yeah, let's give 60 seconds on that, if you would.
Okay. My suspect's a career military man. He ran away from home at age 16, joined the Air Force, spent about 7 years in the Air Force. This was in 1946, starting date. Then he became a Marine for 10 years. Then he joined the U.S. Army in 1964, and he, in fact, was a paratrooper with the U.S. Army. He had a long and lengthy career in the U.S. Armed Services. And in 1971, he was an ROTC instructor at a college campus in Utah, and he was married several times. He's got 3 sons. He told each of his sons at different times that he was D.B. Cooper. He also left behind a widow, and he told her that he was D.B. Cooper. Now, I talked with one of his best friends, who actually is a private investigator.
How about that?
One of the suspect's best friends, who is a private investigator in Salt Lake City, and we had a nice chat on the phone here just a week ago, and he said that the suspect never told him directly he was D.B. Cooper, but he always alluded to it in a third-person kind of narrative. And I asked this guy, I said, why would he do that? And he said, because he didn't trust many people. He would only trust blood. And so he answered, it was a very interesting conversation, but he said that my suspect was basically kind of a loner. He was very skilled, very sharp guy, and you could call him a master criminal if you want, but the FBI wasn't able to get him, and if that turns out to be his shoot, it creates a lot more problems for the FBI, and it looks like D.B. Cooper had a successful jump that night and got away with the money.
Yeah, and there are more things even than what you've listed that bring the two stories together, but time prevents us from going into all of them. Let's go ahead and get Kathy in Massachusetts on Coast to Coast AM for Galen Cook. Go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, good morning, gentlemen. Tonight there was a documentary, and I don't know if it was on the Discovery Channel or History Channel because I don't remember. But I don't know if this is the same suspect you're talking about, but the woman that was interviewed tonight, the story goes that the guy was dying in a hospital room and said to his wife, I've got a secret, I've got to tell you my real name. And he stated he was D.B. Cooper, and that he buried the money and couldn't remember where he buried it. And the person who was the investigator, which I don't remember that name either, because I wasn't really paying that much of attention. And he did say that because of Mount St. Helens blowing when it did, and all the streams and rivers, taking different channels down the mountains, he said that the money was lost forever, probably if it was buried.
Galen, where are you with that?
Yeah, she's talking about Dwayne Weber. This was the Florida suspect, and I've talked with Dwayne's widow several times on the phone over the years, and Dwayne is no longer a suspect. The FBI ruled him out, and I don't think Dwayne would have been a viable suspect. He did spend, I believe, 17 years in various penitentiaries. It's unfortunate that he had to lie to his wife on his deathbed about being D.B. Cooper. It created lots of problems, but Dwayne Weber was not D.B. Cooper. By the way, one more thing, Ian, about the money. The money that was found on the Columbia River is the only money that has ever been found in this D.B. Cooper case. There's still another $195,000 in 20s out there, and the FBI really put this thing out on the media not long after the incident, hoping someone would come up with some of these $20 bills, but not 120 has ever been found in circulation.
Well, now, that would explain one thing, or two things, actually. One is the money that the family of this suspect that we've been talking about, who says they saw a little bit left in one of the briefcases, but not being spent. And the other being the motivation that we originally spoke of, then that this suspect that we refer to tonight had mob debts. He had gambling debts to pay off.
He did.
And that's a very interesting way of laundering that money out of circulation. But we tell you what, Galen, we still got about a half dozen people that want to chime in with a quick comment or a question for you. Can you give us an extra 15 or so?
Sure, and I'd like to get the take on it, on this whole episode from your upcoming guest, too.
Okay, good. We look forward to it. We'll bring you up together then. Vito Colucci coming up next hour, Inside the Private Eyes of a PI. We will get Vito's perspective on this. But first, man, this is why I love this show. Some great tips last hour, by the way. Several people calling in while we were talking with Galen Cook, an attorney turned investigator in the D.B. Cooper case. He's trying to crack it and figuring that the FBI would probably really want to help him. But right now, We don't seem to be getting much cooperation from the FBI. We'll ask Vito Colucci about that a little bit later on this hour. He's the author of Inside the Private Eyes of a PI. One of America's top private detectives gives a behind-the-scenes look into high-profile cases and others. And that's what we want to talk to him about in just a few minutes. We'll bring him into this conversation about his behind-the-scenes perspective on why it is that if the FBI has D.B. Cooper's DNA, at least some partial DNA, and we have a DNA sample that's waiting for us from the family of this suspect who shall not be named yet, but whose family is volunteering him after his passing for reasons which we explained last hour. Why won't they do that? Why won't they connect the dots on that? Or for that matter, the fingerprints that Galen Cook sent over to the FBI. How come that hasn't been at least disqualified? At least say, no, that's not it. That's not the guy. Keep looking. We'll find out more about that, and we'll get to the last couple of calls remaining for Galen Cook coming up next. Should be a very festive half hour on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. So where do we start? Do we leave off anywhere Galen Cook at the end of a sentence or anything that we need to revisit? I can't remember where we were at the top of the hour.
One more thing I just want to mention, Ian. The family of the suspect sent me an 8-millimeter color film that was taken in August of 1973, and it shows the suspect and the second oldest son took a trip with my suspect up to Vancouver, Canada, and this was just days after he had retired from the U.S. Army. This is August 1973. He sent the 8-millimeter clip on DVD. I examined it, and there were some really great moving shots of the suspect, and I went and had them edited down, and in fact, I think Coast to Coast AM probably has that file. I sent them a couple days ago, so I don't know if you plan on putting them up on the web, but they actually show my suspect on an 8-millimeter film that's been converted over to DVD. And the purpose of that trip, according to the son, who is now in his 50s, was to go up and spend a week, just the suspect, and that son, who at that time was 16 years old. And he said they spent exactly one night in Vancouver, and when they were in the motel one night, or maybe it was in the afternoon, the suspect told the son he had something to do and he'd be back in about 2 or 3 hours. About 3 or 4 hours later, he showed up, and he said, I have to head back to the States, and so we're going to have to end our trip real quick. And the son took the 8-millimeter movie camera with him, and they did do a little sightseeing just for a few hours, and that was caught on the tape. And so what I did was I had it edited down, and there's about a 10-second clip of that suspect. Now, what they did in Vancouver, we're not really sure. However, he did go to a safe deposit box up there, and he had a key with him. And I've had that confirmed by all three sons and by the widow. So there was something up there in Vancouver or one of the neighboring areas around Vancouver, Canada, that's in British Columbia, and he had to get to a safe deposit box. So that adds a little more mystery to my suspect, too.
Sure does. And we did link that video, and I meant to mention it earlier. It's at coasttocoastam.com, and you can see in a couple of different formats just that video. Now, this is not video from him in the year of 1971, but it's 1973, and I think you can already even still see similarities there in what we're talking about. All right, so let's go to Chris in New York on Coast to Coast AM for Galen Cook before we get to our guest Vito Colucci in just a minute. Hey, Chris.
Hey, guys. I just got a quick two-part question.
Go ahead.
The $5,000 that was found, that was immediately turned in?
Yes.
Okay, because I was going to say, for instance, if I had found like a few $100s in the woods, I probably wouldn't turn it in. So if the money had made it into circulation otherwise, like I spent it at stores or something, what are the odds that the FBI would pick it up and recognize that it was the money that D.B. Cooper took?
Well, that money that was found along the river was in a deteriorated state. Now, those packets with $20 bills were $2,000 per packet, and they were rubber banded. And that's another interesting clue, and I'm glad you brought this up, Chris. The way those packets of money were found was very unusual. They were laying on top of each other, and one of them, the rubber band had already broken. But how could 3 packets of $20 bills, each containing $2,000, end up on the riverbank buried side by side? If they had flown out of the airplane the night of that jump, that money would never have landed next to each other. It had been blown all over the place. But these 3 packets were laying right on top of each other, but they were independently rubber banded. And so, Ian, you can ask Vito what his take on that is. It's a very baffling clue, and it probably lends a little more credence to the fact that money was purposely planted.
All right, well, you can ask him that, because I'm going to bring you two up together in just a few minutes, but I know Chris had a follow-up question. Chris?
Oh, well, that was my follow-up question.
That was your follow-up. Okay, yeah. Fair enough. Just want to make sure we got it in there. Thank you so much. And Wes is in San Diego on Coast to Coast AM for Galen Cook. Wes?
Yes, good morning, gentlemen.
And
a quick thought on how the discovered portion of the money might have been found where it was. What if he had trekked it to from where he landed? If, in fact, that Amboy location is the location, and 20 miles to the Columbia, if he had a watercraft or somebody to rendezvous with a watercraft.
Wes, the problem is it's 20 miles as the eagle flies,
Correct.
And if you look at the route you'd have to take to get there, it's probably by highway. It probably ends up being about 40 or 50 miles. And if Cooper's on foot, he's not going to be able to do it that night because he knows the bloodhounds and the multitask authorities are going to be chasing him down in the morning. He's got to get out of there that night, and he's not going to have time to cover that much territory and plant the money there. So I don't think he would have done it that night. It would have been later.
Let's get Mike in Nevada, and then we'll bring in Vito Colucci together with Galen Cook in just a second. So be prepared, Galen, what you would ask a private investigator with some experience on this. But, Mike, go ahead.
Hello.
Hi, you had a quick question? Mike, Nevada.
Hello. Yeah, you have Mike here. Do you hear me?
Yes, we do. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, retired Navy parachute rigger, and the only thing I can do is supply you information that you may or may not have concerning the NB6 or NB8 parachutes. They had history cards of the Packers in a small pouch inside, and most parachute riggers put that piece of paper in a plastic bag and then snapped it shut, and they would seal it with either E-thread or 6-cord, and they have a lead seal that they have a hand stamp that is uniquely their own.
How would that be? Let me cut to the chase on this. How would that information pertain to this investigation? What is it that you think that would offer us?
That would have allowed that parachute packer that you indicated to identify whether or not he had any hands-on packing on that unit.
I see.
And then he could track that to his history card, which the FAA requires that a parachute packer, wherever it's packed, maintain a paper copy of the complete history of that parachute.
I appreciate that. Galen, your thought on that?
Well, actually, when I talked with Mr. Cossey, he indicated, and your caller's right, they do put their name and signature in there as the parachute packer, but Mr. Cossey said he not only packed it, but he had rigged and assembled that exact chute, and apparently they do it in such a way where they can identify if they were the ones who assembled it. But I have a quick question for your caller. Actually, 2 questions. Are all Navy chutes white? Is the canopy white? And then my other question to your caller is, why would D.B. Cooper jump out of the plane with an old-style military or Navy emergency chute when one of the other chutes he could have jumped out with was a sport model called a Pioneer?
Mike, any
right,
thought on that?
And a Pioneer is much more harder to pack. An NB8 or an NB6, I can be in the back of the aircraft, open up the panels, check for a tracking radio or beacon, and close it back up safely. And if he's got just minimal training on that, he can do that.
Yeah.
Now, as to the color of the parachutes, Navy and Air Force both have multicolors and white, and the whites were used up in the northern hemisphere to camouflage for snow.
Yeah, this chute they found up in southwest Washington was white.
Very good. Thank you, Mike. And Galen, I want to introduce you to Vito Colucci, who is the author of a book we'll be talking about throughout the rest of the night, Inside the Private Eyes of a PI, one of America's top private detectives. Written a very entertaining book, a bunch of many different stories. Some of you have heard, some of them you haven't heard about, but either way, Vito will give you the behind-the-scenes look of those investigations a little bit later on. But Vito, thank you so much for your patience.
Oh, thank you. It's been very interesting just listening to you guys. You too, Galen.
Well, thank you very much, Vito, and I'm anxious to hear your interview and also maybe get a little bit of response from a question or two that I have for you.
Yeah, go ahead. This is really interesting because we were talking about, first of all, a lot of experience, Vito, for you dealing with the FBI as a private investigator.
Yes, well, both as a police officer, too, because as a police officer, I worked undercover organized crime where I wore a wire, infiltrated some organized crime in regards to dealings by a couple of my bosses on the police department. So I've dealt with the FBI, especially the Connecticut FBI, for many years. And one thing I like to bring up, because I think you had a question before about, well, why isn't the FBI doing more? Why aren't they doing this quicker? Why aren't they looking into this? If I could take a minute or two to kind of give you an idea and an answer on that.
Yeah, because it seems like that's their public posture to say, bring us this information. And when they did earlier with the case from the Kenny Christensen case from Minnesota, the FBI was all over that. They were get it out. They sort of spat out the info, said, no, that's not it. Bring on the next guy. So here we're bringing on the next person, and they don't seem to be moving too fast on that.
Well, here's what I've learned about the FBI, and I deal with them a lot. I've worked with them most recently on the George Smith case, the honeymooner on the Royal Caribbean, trip when he was on his honeymoon. The FBI will prioritize things, okay? They're out there. They're doing the terrorist stuff on a daily basis. They're doing everything else. So a lot of times it may seem, and what the general public doesn't understand is, well, gee, we brought them this a couple of months ago. We haven't heard back from them. And it's not a type of thing where they're just putting it on a shelf. They're just trying to do what they feel a lot of times is more important cases going on. And, there's only so much manpower to go around. I even know what police departments, when I've talked to heads of detective bureaus and everything else, and they've said to me point blank, Vito, that tip you gave us 2 months ago, we started to look into it, but then we got waylaid on some talk about some terrorist thing, or we had to go check on this and check on that. So people need to realize what goes on here, that there's a priority. Now, this case is very interesting, and truthfully, this is the first day when I went on your website, on Coast to Coast website, that I got into it a little bit, and I'll have to start preparing myself because I've done over 400 shows, and I know it's going to wind up being a topic on a lot of the shows.
Someone will throw at you in the future, right?
Right, but that's how it works. I hope I answered that properly. It's the priority of what's important going on in the state, in the country at that time. And they'll put things on the back burner for a while, which a lot of times the public will say, I don't understand it. I never heard anything more about blank, blank, blank.
Right. Galen, you had another question?
It's a good answer you gave, Vito. And I've talked with a number of the agents, and they're pretty straight-up guys. I've enjoyed the conversations, but here, just in the last couple of weeks, they've really been coming out in different forums in the media saying that they want to elicit assistance from the public. And after I talked with Mr. Cossey, who packed that exact chute, I couldn't understand why they didn't go right to him and say, hey, look, can you come down and look at this chute? But they're asking for help from one side, but then they don't get it when it's available. So it's a little confusing, but I think I get it.
Right. It is. But, I even see that sometimes on police departments. Somebody will say to me, Vito, on that murder case, I gave some information to the police that they should see Joe Smith about this and talk to him. He has some information. And I talked to Joe, and oh, my God, nobody in 2 weeks has contacted him. So, there's reasonings for that. It's not that they take the name Joe Smith and just put it into a dead file. It's just something that they get around it a certain way, and they have to do it in the proper timing. And it's tough a lot of times for the public to understand that. And the FBI, man, they're swamped, and they do a great job, man. They make those arrests of different things, either on the terror end or other things. Sometimes we don't even hear it. but yet we go on to live safely. So, I mean, they kept me alive during my time as an undercover cop, and I have a lot of respect for them, and I still do.
I can understand that.
That's a great answer. The one thing that I'm a little bit amused about is every agent I've ever talked to or have read about on these D.B. Cooper files, they all say pretty much the same thing, and the standard line is D.B. Cooper could not have survived that jump that night because of the weather, because it was dark, and the mountains were on one side and the river was the other, and he could not have survived it. But if they found, in fact, D.B. Cooper's chute, which is in a deployed state, it can only mean pretty much one thing if they don't find any bones or a harness next to the chute, and that is that D.B. Cooper got away that night, and, of course, that kind of ruins the FBI's pet theory.
Well, you know what I think on that, for having over 30 years of combined police and private detective work. From what I read on the Coast to Coast site today, was he not a Green Beret?
Actually, it's misstated. He was a paratrooper in the U.S. Army, but I found out he was not actually a Green Beret, but he probably was in Special Forces of some kind.
Okay.
Right.
Well,
Special Forces unit.
When you start hearing that, then anything's possible. See, as an investigator that delves into everything like I do, when I hear something like that, then I more or less think, okay, this guy is good. He's not your normal guy.
The suspect that we have in mind.
So you have to throw out that other thing before of, who could survive this? Who could do this? When you're dealing with certain people, then you have to throw that other logic out, and you can't have tunnel vision. You have to keep your mind open to any possibility, especially when you know that individual's background.
Hey, Galen, is there one woman we're still trying to find, or have you located everybody?
Thank you for bringing that up, Ian. Tina Mucklow, who was the flight attendant on flight number 305 that night, who spent the most time with D.B. Cooper and has also been the most elusive of the crew, I finally got in touch with one of her first cousins, and I sent a picture of my suspect to that person. They wanted to do it that way, and they're going to get the picture to Tina. So I would say in the next couple of weeks, there's a good chance I'll hear back from Tina.
Okay, great. Now, you've obviously done a lot of work on this D.B. Cooper story, but here you've got Vito Colucci. If you had a process question for him,
sure. Anything
else that you think, we've got him here, we could pick his brain for, and then we'll move on to him.
Yeah, let me just ask him this one question. The way I've approached this is to look and examine at the evidence that you have, the material evidence, and the clues that are left behind. Now, the first clue came in 1980 when this 8-year-old kid found the money on the banks of the Columbia River. Then there was a lull for about 27 years with no further clues. A lot of people came out and said, I'm D.B. Cooper, or I was married to D.B. Cooper, or he's my third cousin, but none of that turned out. Now, just less than a month ago, another clue surfaced, and that was the parachute. Now, Vito, my question is, the parachute was found 20 miles away from where the money was found 27 years earlier. And I wondered, as an investigator, what kinds of things are you going to start looking for to try to reconcile these two baffling clues that really don't point to each other and say, these two clues work together?
All right, I'll tell you what, I'm going to ask Vito to hang on for his answer. Galen, you'll be listening on the radio.
I'll be tuned in.
Okay, and then
Thank
in a couple of weeks, when you get more, either when we hear back from Flight Attendant Tina Mucklow or the FBI gets in touch with you about the fingerprints or request for DNA, let us know at any time. And, of course, you can go right now to coasttocoastam.com and look at that video that we've posted. It's of a film that was taken a couple years after the D.B. Cooper jump. But it's right about the time when the son's reported dad, or in this case our suspect, would have to occasionally go up to Canada with a key to a safety deposit box. Just something to add into the mix. And then we'll get back to the answer to the question posed to our main guest, Vito Colucci, next, inside the private eyes of a PI on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. We're going to go inside the private eyes of a PI. We'll talk about some pretty well-known cases and some that you don't know so well, but ones that Vito Colucci did. He investigated people for both celebrity clients and for missing people that you'll never hear about. But for tonight, when you'll know the inside story, the behind-the-scenes look at many of these high-profile cases and what it's like to be a private investigator. Next, we'll start with that conversation that we just left off about D.B. Cooper. How would Vito Colucci, as a PI, reconcile the money found along the Columbia River in 1980 with the parachute found 20 miles or so away in a farmer's field just last week? On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Well, Vito Colucci, I've already enjoyed you as a guest already, and you were just there helping out a past guest. So thank you so much for your contribution. Looking forward to the rest of the show with just the two of us.
Thank you very much.
We've already mentioned, just kind of by way of conversation, a few details of your life. A former Connecticut police officer, then private investigator. How long had you remained a cop?
I was a police officer for 10 years in Stamford, Connecticut. And then I went on for now the last, I think it's a total of 21, 22 years, I've been a private detective.
And this meant that you were a private detective, that you were a police officer in your hometown, correct?
Yes, I'm born and raised here in Stamford, Connecticut, and I still reside here.
All right, so what was that like sometimes when you were having to pull over people that you went to high school with or from the hood?
It's funny you said that. I got put on the narcotics squad. I got on the police department right at 21, as soon as I turned 21. And time I was like 22, 23, I was already on the narcotics squad. And one of the biggest raids we had done at that time was raiding this house of these drug dealers. Wound up being a guy and a girl that just a few years before that I was in high school with, one of them being our class president. And went on to, unfortunately, a life of crime, they did. And it's a funny situation, but I remember the guy looking at me that night and just shrugging his shoulders and saying, hey, you got to do what you got to do, right? And I go, yeah, that's it.
You got to do what you got to do is right. Well, and so as a private investigator, we'll pick more at some of those cases that you write about in the book, and maybe some that you don't, too. Enjoyed it quite a bit. You're a very colorful writer. Seen you on television before. You'll see Vito Colucci frequently on television panel discussions about crime, about cases that are in the news, and we'll talk more about that. But let's go back to the D.B. Cooper case, because it's a simple question, but if you were investigating it, how would you begin to reconcile money found in a riverbank in 1980 and then a parachute found some 20 miles away? What would you do as an investigator to try to connect those dots or not?
Okay, well, if I was hired on this case, the first thing I would probably want to do is be in that area. And what I mean by that is I want to know the lay of the land. I want to know what it was like in 1980 compared to a few years before that, a few years after that. So you want to be able to get a feel for that territory over there, okay? But you know what Galen's doing that is so great, and why I feel he's going to really do very well on this case, is he's teachable. And when I spoke at the PI convention in Las Vegas a couple years ago, and I taught a lot of the younger guys that you have to remain teachable. You don't get an attitude, well, I know it all, you can't tell me anything about this case. What Galen's doing before, even with your call-in person, he's asking them questions. He's asking me questions. That's how you solve a case. You delve into the more eyes and ears working a case, the better. Not necessarily just working, that you can go to and ask them those questions, and like I said, that 20-mile, it sounds like a lot. That's not a big territory where one thing is found and something else is. I would want to know everything about that area. I would want to know family trees if I can get them. If we have a possible suspect, I want to know every reason and everything out there, as well as picking the brains of other people. And that's what Galen's doing, and that's why I think he's doing a great job.
And so, all right, so we're going to pick the brains of people. At some point, I mean, you got to start to look at the disparity of time, of the location.
Makes it very tough. That's right.
Yeah. The conditions under which both cases were both discovered. What would be your antenna on even the thought offered by the one suspect that Galen Cook and I have been talking about, this one man whose wife is still alive, who says that the money was in that riverbank as a plant, that he would have planted it there to divert attention away from where he actually landed and would have left from. Any idea on that?
I agree with that logic. I wrote it down right on my piece of paper here, planted, after I heard you guys talk about that. Number one, because who you're talking to what? The wife. Okay,
right.
She knows the individual better than anybody. Okay, so you're taking what she's saying, and you're putting that together with what we said before: the knowledge of this individual, his training, his background and training as a paratrooper, and all the other stuff. So you start putting this all together, and you go, all right, that makes sense. He plants this over here for what reason? Now, you may not come up with the reason. Exactly. But you still look at that as, he did this to kind of throw people off or to do this or to do that. But the key person, obviously, is that woman right now. And thank God that she's still alive and she's out there where you can just say to her, can I call you anytime and ask you a question? You wake up 3 o'clock in the morning, you're not going to call her then, but the next day you pick up a phone and say, let me ask you this. Would he do this, this, or that? And you start putting it together. But, I mean, it's intriguing, and I'm going to start, like I said, today was the first day when I went on your webpage where I started to read it, and it is quite intriguing, and I study all of my cases before I do the television shows and everything. Anybody, that's why I feel I've done over 400, that they keep calling me, because I go on these shows, and I really know what I'm talking about. I do my homework, so to speak.
I'm sure Galen Cook would love any help you can give him, and we'd love to keep reporting back on the story. And we think that if we keep, torquing this a little bit, that we'll get somewhere. So thanks for your thoughts on that in the future. And then I guess that sort of brings us to just sort of the investigative technique in general, because, and we all have sort of a TV image of private eyes, and I'm interested in private eye. I think being a private eye sounds really cool.
Yep.
But I mean, like, how much of a case like this, when you decide to look into it, and you've looked into other cases where you've been brought in by celebrity lawyer Mickey Sherman or other cases, are there times when you look at a case like this and you just think, well, the trail is too dead. There's nothing that a private investigator can ever really find out. At this point, the police have looked at it a million times. The FBI has looked at it a million times. There's nothing left for me.
Oh, yes, that definitely does happen, okay. Ian. I've turned down cases. I've sat with clients that have wanted to give me amounts of money to get involved. And, a lot of times that same scenario you just said, I have said to them, you had all these agencies, you had this, you had that, 15, 18 years have gone by. Save your money. Now, on the other hand, I've jumped into some of them that intrigued me. And what I tell a client? I never promise them anything. I say to them, I'm going to do the best possible work that anybody can do, and I will at least give you my comments, my answers, what I feel about the case. So it's intriguing that way too, Ian.
I understand that. I guess that was my backdoor into the Michael Skakel investigation. Here was a case. The death of teenager Martha Moxley in Greenwich. Here's a case that has sort of grown stone cold. Police had investigated, everybody investigated, and it took a couple of different books on the subject, one of whom was by the guy we were talking about last hour, Mark Furman, to suddenly heat up the investigation. Now the police are looking into it. Mark Furman writes a book, and next thing you know, pretty soon there's an indictment against Michael Skakel. So what was different about that case? Why were they able to get an indictment out of a case that had been considered closed?
Well, I worked for the defense team on that one, Ian. I was involved right from the beginning. I was the only one rehired from the first team that went on to the second team to work the appeals. And this is not the common feeling amongst people out in the world. They felt he was guilty. He got what he deserved. I talk about in the book when you're a cop or a PI, you get that one case in your life that something goes wrong where you feel that, oh, my God, it should have went a different way. And that's the one case for me. Because when you delve into this and look into this, he was convicted by a group of people, several different people that took the witness stand, one of which was loaded with heroin. He died before he could testify. They had to read his testimony, who afterwards I found out from his own mother and brother that he had said to them when they said, "What are you talking about? What information do you have?" And he told them, "Keep quiet. I'm going to get a reward." So, I mean, there was a lot of different people of that nature that was brought forward. And it wasn't even a lot. It was a handful of people. It was an old case. Somebody had to pay for this, okay? It was an old case that lingered on. And believe me, I'm a law and justice type of guy. I put away a lot of murderers and different things, and I've worked many cases even as a PI. But this case did not go the proper way. Trust me, the wrong man is in jail on this. And there's many people that feel that way. But, it is what it is. We have a great justice system. They looked into it. They don't agree with me on that. And, the jury found him guilty. They looked over at him, and I remember the first day of the trial, I looked over at the jury, and I saw some disgusting looks on some of the people's faces as they looked at Michael Skakel sitting there, and then looked over at Mrs. Moxley, who's a great woman, a very nice woman who I got to talk to during the trial. And it was kind of like, let's put this to rest. Let's end this whole thing. So, I mean, that's my opinion on that case. A lot of people in the public would not agree with me, but I can't help that. I've sat with that man right in the office where I'm sitting right here. He sat a few feet away. I'm not easily fooled. I asked him the hard questions, and I really, to this day, still believe in him.
And I understand that, and that's totally fair. I read your chapter on Michael Skakel, and I did have trouble sort of reconciling the fact that there had been comments that were made and seemed like, I mean, I knew somebody from Greenwich who knew them both as teenagers, knew both the Michael Skakel and knew the victim. And she felt from early on that it was the Skakel boys, that the Skakel boys were involved, and it was just, that was a neighborhood thing. And I realized that that's not enough to convict somebody, but it was an interesting perspective to talk to somebody who had been sort of at ground zero of the case,
right,
and had known enough about the way in which Michael Skakel used to look at Martha, or the way in which those conversations went, or other things that happened afterward, to say that there was just so much around him and that case that it couldn't have just been, something that was concocted later on by somebody else with false testimony.
Right. Well, see, also what you have to look at, too, what gets me aggravated is that he was tried as an adult, okay? Right. And that was a big point that was tried to work out in the court. And he had just turned 15 at the time when this all happened, okay? He was around for all these 20, 25 years. He wasn't somebody that went overseas and did an Alex Kelly type of a thing, hid from everybody. They could have put their hand on him at any time. When they wound up arresting him, they tried him as an adult. He was 41 years old. Instead of going back and saying, and the reasoning for that was, well, we have to try him as an adult now because we have no kind of facility. What can we do with a 41-year-old guy? We can't put him in, a juvenile facility type of a thing. And, that was another thing. He was 15. That's like me coming to you at a point in your life and say, Ian, look, we know what you did back when you were 15. We got some evidence on that break-in or this or that, blah, blah, blah. And you go, well, yeah, geez, I was real stupid back then. You got me. Yeah, but Ian, we're going to try you as an adult. As an adult? I'm 40-something years old. What are you talking about? Well, I'm sorry. We're going to try you as an adult. Everybody that I have said that to shakes their head and says that doesn't make any sense at all. He went on to counsel alcoholics. He went on to do a lot of good things. He was a skier, a top-notch skier. He helped a lot of people that came to the witness stand that said that he really helped me. He counseled me, got me off the alcohol, everything of that nature. So, this was not a hardened criminal. This was somebody that I feel, when the bottom line came, it should have been done as a juvenile. Those laws should have went in effect, and we argued that, and it just didn't work out.
And I understand that. I think some of the feeling about that is that that wouldn't have been enough justice, because as a juvenile, it wouldn't have, if he had been willing to come out and admit and say, yes, I did this, but to go down that prosecution, to have to be forced to do a prosecution, then they're going to go for the higher sentence for all of that trouble. If he had confessed to it and then he'd gotten, cut a deal where he was going to be convicted as a juvenile, well, then maybe he could have gone down that road. But it seems like you can't have it both ways in the justice system. But I don't want to get too deep into that case because there's so much more interesting material. First of all, let me ask you, I mean, when you got out of the regular police work and you became a private detective, what was the general feeling from your former colleagues in the police department? Are you considered a sellout? Do they not work with you? Do they try to work with you? Are they jealous? What's the story?
No, I have a very good relationship, not only with my former department. Of course, it's many years now. There's not many of the same guys and girls I worked with, but, all the neighboring ones. See, when I do a case, especially when I'm working for, let's say, the family of a victim, I work what I say parallel with the police department. That means like somebody's son is murdered, and the police are working on the case, and the mother and father hire me also. What happens is I'm doing my investigation. I'm not going against the police. As I develop any evidence, I turn it over to the police that same day or the next day. I don't have powers of arrest anymore. I'm not a police officer, so I don't interfere with anything they're doing. There's been many cases I've done where the detective sergeant has talked with me, and I've given him what I've gotten new the last day or two. He may say to me, "Don't bother talking to Bob Jones or Joe Smith. I've already done that."